And now I'm pleased to introduce Timothy Snyder. Timothy Snyder is a professor of history at Yale University, focusing on modern East European political history. Having received his PhD from Oxford, he has held fellowships here at Harvard and at various institutions abroad. He has written a number of prize-winning historical studies, including most recently The Red Prince, The Secret Lives of a Habsburg Archduke, and Sketches from a Secret War, a Polish artist's mission to liberate Soviet Ukraine. Professor Snyder's new book, Bloodlands, illuminates the events at German and Soviet killing sites that fell behind the Iron Curtain after the end of World War II and thus have been largely ignored. A recent review in The Economist says Mr. Snyder's book is revisionist history at its best. In spare, closely argued prose with meticulous use of statistics, he makes the reader rethink some of the best-known episodes of Europe's modern history. And a starred review in Kirkus calls it a significant work of staggering figures and scholarship. And now please join me in welcoming Professor Timothy Snyder.
I'm very glad to be here. I'm particularly glad to be in this bookstore. As I was being introduced, in order to avoid listening to flattering words about myself, I instead calculated how much of my income I spent here when I lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And it's somewhere between 7 and 10%. I especially like the remainders table over there, which I visited weekly for years. Having finished a book is different from having considered writing a book. It's different from writing a book. Now that this book is done, what I would like to do is share with you in the next 25 or 30 minutes a sense of why a book like this ought to have been written and a sense of how I wrote it, and then finally a sense at the end of what it might all mean. The reason why I thought a book such as this was indispensable was that there was no history of the event it chronicles. Between 1933 and 1945, the German and the Soviet regimes together killed about 17 million people. About 14 million of these people, and by people I mean civilians and prisoners of war, I'm not talking about soldiers in combat, about 14 of these 17 million people died in a relatively small area, which in the book's title is called the Bloodlands, between the Baltic and the Black Seas, from north to south, between Berlin and Moscow, let's say, from west to east, more or less Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states, Western Russia. So 14 million people were murdered by two regimes over the course of 12 years. There are few comparable catastrophes in history. There are probably only one or two comparable man-made calamities in history, and yet there was no study of this event. Why not? Let me start with self-criticism, or what's always more enjoyable, criticism of colleagues. The area which I'm just described is fairly coextensive with what historians think of as Eastern Europe. It's not all of Eastern Europe, but it's a big part of Eastern Europe. And yet East European historians, those of us here and those of us in Eastern Europe, haven't seen this problem the way I've just described it. I think this has to do with the fact that East European historians are normally concerned with one nation, which means that we see only part of the problem. It also means that we tend to be caught in polemics. I might, for example, be interested in telling you that the Poles were not as bad as you think they were during the Second World War. Or in a mid-career transition, I might change my mind and decide to tell you that they were worse than you thought during the Second World War. Either way, I'm engaged in polemics or apologetics that are nationally bound. And insofar as I am nationally bound as a scholar, I cannot see the totality of this calamity. In Soviet history, there's been enormous progress, especially as concerns two of the events I describe in this book, the famine in Soviet Ukraine in the early 30s and the Great Terror of 1937 and 1938. We now know much more than we did factually 20 years ago. The weakness of Soviet history is that it tends not to be geographical. One can very easily overlook the fact that Soviet deliberate killing took place in the western part of the Soviet Union disproportionately, and disproportionately on the lands which were also occupied by the Germans. And indeed, that's another definition of the bloodlands. These are territories which were occupied, ruled by both the Soviets and the Germans. The Holocaust is the central and climactic event within this account, and yet there are weaknesses within Holocaust historiography which I believe have prevented it from being fully understood on its own and from being integrated into this larger history. This has to do chiefly with the fact, I think, that the history of the Holocaust is essentially a history of Germany. About 98 or 99% of the books which are published, which you will see in this bookstore, for example, having to do with the Holocaust, use German sources alone. This means that you can go very far, although not all the way to the end, I don't think, but you can go very far in understanding German institutions and German motivations. You can take part in debates about which is more important, motivations or institutions, and that's been the central debate in German history. And then you can make the move which the Holocaust historiography has made, which is to consider the point of view of the victims. However, insofar as you're using German language sources, you're only considering 3% of the victims of the Holocaust. The tremendous majority of the victims of the Holocaust were Jews who did not speak German, who were well beyond the range of German-speaking civilization. And so, in order to get the Holocaust itself right, one must move well beyond German history in the sense of using German sources, even if those sources are, for example, German language diaries. That can only take you so far. Another problem we've all had to contend with has been the taboo on comparisons. It's very often thought that if one mentions Stalin and Hitler in the same book, that means that one is comparing them, and the next move is to say that a comparison is illegitimate because a comparison can only belittle one or the other. Today, generally what that means, belittling the crimes of Hitler. I would say, on the contrary, that, and I'll try to develop this argument, that it's impossible to understand the depth of the crimes of either Hitler or Stalin without bringing them both into the picture. Consider this. Everywhere that the Germans killed in large numbers was later ruled by the Soviets. And the place where the Soviets killed in the largest numbers in the 30s was occupied by the Germans thereafter. How can we not believe that that has some significance, and how can we not investigate what significance that might be? Another problem, and this comes from Hannah Arendt, of whom I think very highly in many respects, is the problem of totalitarianism. Insofar as comparisons between the Soviets and the Nazis have been permitted, it's very often been within this framework. Now, what the totalitarian framework does is it authorizes us to see Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union as two instances of the same kind of totalitarian system. The problem with this is that it focuses our attention on Moscow and on Berlin. It asks us to look at Soviet society and German society as examples, whereas in fact, I think the heart of the problem of totalitarianism, or whatever one wishes to call it, is not in Berlin or in Moscow, but rather precisely in the lands between, where all of the killing takes place. At least that's my premise. That brings me to the how. How could one write a history of this sort in a way which might be effective and convincing and true? The methods were really very simple. The first was to take for granted that history is inclusive of everything which happens. That's maybe not as trivial as it sounds. What it means is to deny claims of this kind, that the Holocaust was so horrible that we cannot conceive of it within history, that we must treat sources having to do with the Holocaust in a different way, that we must somehow only, when we discuss the Holocaust itself. It also means excluding claims of this kind, that Soviet modernization had a purpose, that the Soviets understood history, that Stalin's terror, for example, was justified in a metaphysical way because he knew that the Germans were going to invade, that because that Marxism had an understanding of history, we must respect it. Both Hitler and Stalin had strong arguments about why their regimes were special and not subject to normal historical analysis. I find it striking the extent to which we still accept, even as we reject everything else about those regimes, those kinds of claims. Second method, history involves a time and a place. What I consider is the 14 million deaths which occur in this defined territory between the Baltic and the Black Seas between early 1933 and spring 1945. This time and place gives me a method, it gives me a subject, and I like to think it gives me a source of insights. This method allows me, among other things, to embrace both of the regimes, but in a way which is not an abstract comparison between the two. I'm considering the territories were both ruled and were both killed in chronological order. Considering the people, as well as the regimes, means that the book has a different perspective. It is concerned at times with the perspective of the killers, but because what I'm concerned with chiefly is understanding how it is people died, its perspective is also that of the people who died up until the moment, literally, in some cases, when they did. A third part of the method is to distinguish between deliberate killing and camps. There has been a great confusion in the literature, I mean by that both the novels and the history of these events, between concentration camps and killing facilities. And until we get that distinction clear, we cannot understand the Holocaust, we cannot understand mass killing in general, and we cannot understand the 20th century. Concentration camps killed. They killed sometimes in large numbers. The Soviet Gulag system killed about 500,000 people between 1941 and 1943. The German camp system killed about 1 million people at the very end of the war. They killed then because they were under stress. They were not meant to kill. About 90% of the people who entered the Gulag left it alive. Most of the people who entered the German camp system also left it alive. When people were killed, for the most part, they were not entering into camps first. Most of the victims of both regimes never saw a concentration camp. People were gassed in places which were not camps. People were shot over pits, and people were starved. Those are the ways that 14 million people were killed. The camps were horrible, but insofar as we think the camps were the worst of the 20th century, we're euphemizing the 20th century. Another part of the historical method is to accept plural causality. I mean a number of things by that. One thing I mean is that we can't expect that you can understand any national tragedy within national history alone. As much as one knows about Jewish history, one cannot explain the Holocaust solely within Jewish history. As much as one knows about Ukrainian history, one cannot explain the famine of 1933 by way of Ukrainian history. As much as one knows about Polish history, one cannot explain Katyn by way of Polish history alone. Another example of plural causality is taking for granted that one cannot understand the Germans or the Soviets without thinking about how they saw each other and understanding how they interacted, both in anticipation of what the other might do, sometimes in cooperation, and as enemies on the battlefield. Another part of plural causality is to accept that killing policies are related one to the other. The Soviet terror, for example, had something to do with the famine that preceded it, which it did. That the Holocaust had something to do with the starvation of Soviet prisoners of war, which immediately preceded it, which it did. Another part of the method is to avoid what I take to be a very sterile opposition between economics and ideology. At the moment in our culture, we tend to distinguish between these things very sharply. And we tend to believe that regimes, both the Nazi and the Soviet, were evil because they held wrong ideas. And of course, that's true, as far as it goes. The problem with this sort of thinking, and with this kind of moralizing cultural history, is that it ignores how ideas of race, for example, are linked to ideas of economics. Or in the Soviet case, how ideas of progress are linked to ideas of economics. And how, to take the point a bit further, ideologies can't really function without economic purchase. And of course, the point works the other way around. Economies can't really work without a covering ideology. That's true of all economies and all systems, but it's also true of the Nazis and the Soviets. And insofar as we leave out the economics, which we now tend to do, we are making the regimes less horrible than in fact they were. Because one of the things which makes them so dreadful is that in their economic calculuses, they would not treat human life as of any significance. And that's one of the most terrible things about these regimes. The final part of the method is to use, and again, like all of these things, this may seem obvious once I say it, but it's to use the sources in all the languages of the peoples who were involved, from Germany to Russia, with pretty much everything in between. This is important for the primary sources, but it's also very important for the secondary sources. I criticized colleagues earlier, but having said that, I should also say that much of what is in this book would be impossible without the work of Russian historians, Ukrainian historians, Polish historians, and above all, German historians. So what does this give us? What happens if we follow these methods? The book is divided into chapters, each of which concerns a major killing policy, with the exception of the introduction. The introduction reminds us of the First World War. In particular, it recalls the forgotten Eastern Front. It recalls the way in which both the Germans and the Bolsheviks regarded the East, what we see as the East, for the Bolsheviks, of course, it was the West, as a kind of land of opportunity. In particular, it reminds us of the importance of the Ukrainian breadbasket, this more or less quasi-mythical place where a land of milk and honey, where food would be infinite. This was incredibly important in the political economy of the time, where food was basically to them what oil is to us, a resource which seemed to be scarce by its nature. The first chapter concerns the Ukrainian famine of 1933. It discusses collectivization. It discusses the famine in Kazakhstan. It makes the point that one of the reasons we know that Stalin's starvation in Ukraine was deliberate was because he had seen and knew about the famine in Kazakhstan. And it follows the chronology, especially the chronology of 1932, the autumn, where we know now step by step what Stalin was ordering. The evidence is now very good that he was taking steps deliberately which he knew would lead to mass starvation. Probably about 3 million more people died than had to in that famine. The next chapter, and this is the link between famine and terror, is about class terror. Although we imagine that the major victims of the Soviet terror were bespectacled intellectuals such as ourselves, I'm wearing contacts, in fact, the major victims were peasants. Stalin was concerned about some kind of war scenario in which peasants alienated by famine, collectivization, and the Gulag would ally with foreign powers. Japan and Poland were the ones he had in mind. Germany was in third place. Therefore, the first major killing action within what we call the Great Terror was the so-called Kulak action, in which around 400,000 people were shot. Most of them were peasants. That was the largest shooting action by a modern state against civilians ever carried out to that point. About 400,000 of the 700,000 victims of the Great Terror were killed in this Kulak action. The vast majority of the rest were killed in ethnic shooting actions, which began at around the same time, July of 1937. The largest of these was the Polish action, in which more than 100,000 men, women, not very many children, mostly men, were shot on completely spurious charges of being spies for Poland. There was also an Estonian action, a Latvian action, a Finnish action, and so on and so on. Most of the minorities which could be associated with powers beyond the Soviet Union were targeted. These were very large ethnic killing actions. Nothing on this scale was taking place anywhere else in the world at the time, with the exception of Outer Mongolia. What I'm trying to say is that Germany had not undertaken ethnic killing on anything like this scale in the 1930s. It was Stalin who pioneered it. The fourth chapter concerns what I think of as the joint decapitation of Poland. The Soviet Union and Nazi Germany jointly invade Poland in September 1939. They pursue a strategy of rule which, although based on different ideologies, is very similar in the execution, which is to say both are concerned with what they both call the Polish intelligentsia. What they mean to do is destroy the Polish nation's ability to govern itself by killing the people who are associated with culture and with politics. And their demographic profiling is so similar that in a number of cases known to us, the Soviets kill one sibling and the Germans kill another sibling. About 200,000 people are killed in Poland, several thousand in the Baltic states as well at this time. The next chapter concerns what the Germans meant to do when they invaded the Soviet Union, and then a bit of what they did. What the Germans meant to do when they invaded the Soviet Union was much worse than anything they in fact carried out. German planning, which we have in black and white, envisioned that 30 million people would be starved to death in the first winter after the war. It envisioned that tens of millions more people would be killed, deported beyond the Urals, starved, forcibly assimilated or enslaved in order to create for the Germans a frontier empire reaching to the Urals. It envisioned, of course, also the removal of the Jews. These things cannot be carried out as they were originally planned because the Germans not only don't win the war, they don't move nearly as fast as they expect to in the summer and fall of 1941. Where their effect or where their moral premises are most clearly fulfilled, I think, is in the starvation of Soviet prisoners of war. The Germans purposely starve all the Soviet prisoners of war that they take. As a result, something like 2.6 million people die of hunger-related diseases. Another 500,000 are shot. Of these people who are shot, disproportionately, these people are Jews. Which brings me to the event which we call the Holocaust, which I break into 3 chapters. One concerns mass shooting. As it begins, mass shooting of whole communities in the summer of 1941. This chapter concentrates on Ukraine. A second chapter explores the relationship between anti-partisan operations in Belarus and the mass shooting of Jews, 2 different crimes which, for reasons of Nazi ideology and also for reasons of Soviet provocations, blur into each other by the end of the war. The third chapter about the Holocaust concerns the death factories in Poland. As you probably know, the first technology of killing in the Holocaust was not gassing. The first technology was shooting. It was shooting which brought death to about the first 1 million Jews. It was shooting which convinced Himmler and therefore Hitler that a final solution could mean mass murder rather than some kind of deportation. The technique of gassing was developed for the euthanasia program. It was used then in the gas vans in late 1941 in Belarus and Ukraine. It was then used in fixed facilities in Chełmno, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka in 1942 in Poland. All in all, the Germans killed about 5.4 million Jews. Roughly 2.6 million of them were shot, roughly 2.8 million were gassed, and tens of thousands more died while deported to the ghettos or of hunger and disease in the ghettos. The final chapter concerns Warsaw in 1944 and the German attempt to destroy the city during and after the Warsaw Uprising. It concentrates in particular on the roughly 120,000 Polish civilians who were murdered during the uprising in incidents separate from combat. I close the book with 2 subjects which are not mass killing, partly to bring the war to an end, partly to help us understand why our memory of these things has gone awry a bit. One of these chapters concerns ethnic cleansing. Although ethnic cleansing can lead to a great number of deaths, I distinguish it just as I distinguish concentration camps from deliberate policies of killing. I do, however, think it's worth discussing because it's the way the war ends. As the war ends, Nazi power gives way to Soviet. Policies of mass killing give way to policies of ethnic cleansing. In the Soviet Union itself, interestingly, the last major Soviet shooting action is Katyn in 1940. After that, the Soviets deport in huge numbers, they ethnically cleanse in huge numbers, but mass shooting actions are more or less a thing of the past. The ethnic cleansing concerns the Caucasian peoples who were deported to Central Asia, it concerns the Crimean Tatars and other Crimean peoples, it concerns the Balts, it concerns the Ukrainians, it concerns the Poles, and in the largest numbers, it concerns the Germans. The final chapter is about Stalinist anti-Semitism, which is a development which doesn't lead to very many deaths, but it does contribute, in my view, a great deal to the clouding of all these events. It reminds us that in all of the lands where Hitler killed, Stalin after the war exercised control. And this meant that events such as, for example, the Holocaust didn't take on the kind of peculiar clarity that they might have. They were blurred into other narratives, and what's worse, in 1953 in the Soviet Union, and then again in 1968 in Poland, and also during a show trial in Czechoslovakia, some of the Hitlerian tropes about Jews were imported into Stalinism, making the ideas, for example, of a Jewish conspiracy last for generations longer than they might have otherwise. A couple of words in conclusion, one about modernity and one about comparison. One of the great theses about why these events come about is that they have something to do with modernity. I'm not persuaded that this is true in any simple way. However, there is a way in which you can discuss what I've just talked about in terms of modernity. You can see, for example, that Stalin was trying to modernize the Soviet Union. And you can see collectivization as modernization, and you can see the terror as a retreat when modernization doesn't work out as well, either economically or politically, as it's expected to do. You can see what the Germans and the Soviets are up to between 1939 and 1941 in Poland as a kind of de-enlightenment. They understand the nature of the Polish Enlightenment, that it's concentrated in elites, known as the intelligentsia, and each, for their own reasons, is concerned with eliminating that intelligentsia. In other words, you can see the Germans and the Soviets as having their own modernities, both concerned to destroy a third, that is the Polish. You can understand the German campaign against the Soviet Union as demodernization. Generalplan Ost and the Hunger Plan, these plans, as I mentioned earlier, specifically provided for the reversal of Soviet modernization. So, for example, the Germans observed that about 30 million more people lived in the Soviet West in cities than had been before, which coincided with the 30 million people who were supposed to starve. Those cities were then going to be razed, that is, destroyed, or much reduced in size before they became German colonies. These things were not fully carried out, but that was the plan. And one can also understand the Holocaust as a retreat from that plan. Of all the things that the Germans imagined that they were going to do in the Soviet Union, the one which they actually fulfilled was the elimination of the Jews, which they moved up. In the original calendar, it was to take place after the war. They moved that up to the course of the war, and they found the way that they were going to carry it out, which was by mass killing, which they began to do during the war itself. A final word about comparison. This is not a book about comparison. This is a book about mass killing, and my purpose was to describe and explain all the major episodes of mass killing so that this historical event can come clear. I only compare at the very end, and the reason why I do this is that I think in large measure our previous comparisons haven't been authorized. I think until we understand the scope and the nature of the mass killing, we're not really in a position to compare the two regimes. And I think that in this way, the theoretical comparisons have raced ahead, partly thanks to Arendt's very impressive book, of our actual knowledge about the events. That said, let me now let me just tell you my position about comparison, which is this: the idea that the two regimes are incomparable is in itself illogical. If I tell you that you may not compare the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, all I am saying is that I have already compared them, and I would prefer that you not do so. Logically speaking, that statement has no other possible content, because to say that things are incomparable is to make a comparative claim. You can't possibly say things are incomparable without having compared them first. So the whole business, in my view, is just logically unauthorized. In addition, what I would say is that if you look at these things case by case, as I have, you find things which undo what we take for granted about the comparison. So, for example, in America, I think, in the English-speaking world in general, there's a kind of compromise which says, on the one hand, the Germans were worse, we'll admit that, because they killed racially. But, on the other hand, the Soviets killed far more people, endless millions in the Gulag. That is simply not true. The Germans killed more people than the Soviets. So that compromise position is simply not true. Even if you count people who died in the Gulag, the Germans killed more people than the Soviets. But it's also not true that only the Germans killed for reasons of race. Race was much more important to National Socialism, obviously, than to Stalinism. However, it's not only the case that Nazi tropes find their way into Stalinism, it's also the case that the Soviets pioneer ethnic mass shootings in the 1930s, and any chronology of ethnic killing has to include that. Another thing that I would say about comparison is this: that we compare, that's a kind of intellectual luxury. We can do that from a distance. When we observe the history more closely, what we see is interaction between the two regimes. We see, for example, Hitler using the famine in Ukraine as he runs for election in 1933, as an example of what will happen if you vote for what he calls the Marxists. You see Stalin using Hitler's crimes to justify his Cold War empire 20 years later. And in between, you see the Germans involved in Stalin's phantom scenarios, which bring about famine and terror. You see a very real alliance against Poland, which is how the war begins. You see the Germans taking advantage of NKVD killings in 1941, when they invade the Soviet Union. They bring bodies from prisons where people had been shot by the NKVD and display them. This is tremendously important symbolically, because up until that point, the NKVD had shot in secret. The 682,691 deaths associated with the Great Terror were not known to the larger world. The Poles, who had a lot of spies in the Soviet Union, did not know there was a Polish action, even though more than 100,000 people were shot in it. So this was a moment when the crimes of the Soviet Union were revealed. You see, for example, that the Germans took so many prisoners of war in order to starve them because Stalin wouldn't let them retreat. You see that so many people died in reprisals for partisan actions in Belarus because the Soviet partisans very consciously provoked the Germans into reprisals, knowing that when they took food from one village, making that food unable to deliver food to the Germans, that village was going to be destroyed, but they might get a few recruits. That was conscious policy. And we're talking about a very serious crime there. More than 300,000 non-Jewish people are killed in reprisals in Belarus, which is a huge number. About an equal number of Jews are killed in the Holocaust. About 700,000 are killed in the prisoner of war camps. And about 1 million people are moved by the Germans during the war. Belarus is the place which is most touched by the war in the entire world. Or, for example, consider this. I don't really write about the Gulag, but as I mentioned, about 500,000 people die in the Gulag in 1941, 1942, 1943. There. Sorry, your foot's on his tail. Your foot's on his tail. Okay, sorry. Consider this. Those people are in the Gulag because they've been sentenced by the Soviet regime, but they die because the Germans invade the Soviet Union, thereby disrupting food supplies and logistics. Are these people, 531,000 people, not a small number, are they victims of Hitler or are they victims of Stalin? Or is it impossible to understand their history without looking at both? Which is the final thing that I would want to say about the comparison. We can decide that we're not going to compare. However, the hundreds of millions of people who lived and died under Soviet and German rule both had to compare. The stakes for them were vital in the literal and rarely used sense of that word. They were trying to survive. This meant that people who we might find sympathetic and people who we might find unsympathetic were always comparing. Ukrainians who during the famine of 1933 wished for a German invasion because they couldn't imagine anything more awful than what they were experiencing were comparing. Then they got to see what a German invasion would be like. People who collaborate with both regimes, and there are a lot of them, were comparing. How could they not? People who denounced Jews in 1941 like they had denounced Poles in 1938 were comparing. They were seeing similarities. They were deciding upon their own behavior. Poles who flee in both directions when their country is invaded by both the Soviets and the Germans are comparing. Jews who don't know enough to compare in 1941 because the Soviets haven't been writing about German anti-Semitism in the press are comparing. It's a flawed comparison because Germany and Soviet Union are in an alliance and they die as a result. Belarusian families whose sons have to fight either for the Germans or the Soviet partisans upon pain of death from both sides are comparing. Prisoners of war in the German camps who are hungry, who have survived the Ukrainian famine, are comparing, and some of them write about the comparison. It seems to me that if we're going to understand these policies and their fates, it would be a disservice not only to them, but to history to somehow try to make that comparison impossible. Thanks. Let me take the two questions in order. Yes, these are very much borderlands in many different senses. So, for example, they are political borderlands between two great powers, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. They are what we now think of when we think of borderlands, which is ethnically mixed territories. So Poland, for example, where much of this action takes place, is a country which is about 65% Polish, but has very large Ukrainian minority, about 5 million, Jewish minority, about 3 million, Belarusian minority, about 1 million, Germans, about 500,000. And then Ukraine is, of course, not just full of Ukrainians, it also has Poles and Jews and Russians and many other people, Armenians, Muslims, Czechs, Germans. So they are borderlands in our postmodern sense of the word as well. And in particular, that sense of the word is important because these are, sad to say, but these are also the historical homelands of the European Jews. This is where most of world Jewry lived before the Holocaust. And what I'm pointing out in this book, among other things, is that the very terrain where the Holocaust took place is also where other horrible episodes of mass killing took place. And that there is, in some case, a relationship between one and the other. And then the third way in which these are borderlands is in the old colonial sense. That is, both the Germans and the Soviets, just to take the most obvious and most important example, saw Ukraine as colonial booty. They saw it as something which had to be controlled because its black earth was so fertile. Which leads me to your second question. And I want to preface my answer to it by saying this. When I say that for various reasons I believe that comparisons are authorized, but that comparisons ought to be informed by a history of the killing, I'm certainly not saying that the two regimes were the same, and I want to be absolutely clear about that. There are very important differences, and one of them is suggested by your question, which I think frames the issue very well. The German plan for the Soviet Union was to make of the Western Soviet Union a frontier empire for racial masters, denuded of population, clear of most of its cities, and this plan required aggressive war. It took for granted aggressive, quick, victorious war. That was the premise of the whole thing. So you can think of the Germans as having had four utopias in the 1930s and 40s. Well, in 1941 in particular, the utopia of lightning victory, that the Soviet Union would fall down, as Hitler put it, like a house of cards. The utopia of the hunger plan, that you could get people to starve themselves. The utopia of Generalplan Ost, which was that you could depopulate regions and move demography very quickly. And then the utopia of the final solution, which was that somehow on the territory of the Soviet Union or somewhere else, you could get rid of Europe's Jews. These utopias all involve, the final three of them require the first. You have to have that magical, horrible, rapid victory over the Soviet Union. Whereas, as you quite rightly suggest, by this moment, the Soviet Union is no longer a revolutionary state in the sense of believing it can bring its revolution to the whole world. There was a moment when it was, and that was earlier. And that's a difference which I try to explain in the introduction. But in the 1930s, as I understand it, what Stalin is doing is building what he called earlier socialism in one country, which rather than external colonization requires internal colonization. Now, internal colonization is quite horrible the way Stalin carries it out. But I agree with you that there's a difference between exploiting peoples who are within one state and first carrying out a war to exploit them. And indeed, the subject of the whole book really is what happens when first you have internal colonization in these territories, and then you have external colonization. So thanks. It touches on it in all kinds of different ways. Let me mention three. One of them is that I am trying a bit to let's say, supplement that optic. Because, of course, it's quite true that the Soviet Union bore the brunt of the fighting on the Eastern Front. When the Americans landed at Normandy, which for us is somewhere towards the beginning of the war on the Eastern Front had already turned, and the Soviets were planning Bagration, which was, in my view, the key battle of the Second World War, which they were just about to win in Belarus. Supplied by American Studebakers and jeeps, which are just as important as Normandy, if not more so. I agree completely with that. However, we tend in our commemorations, and therefore also in our history, to think about May 1945, rather than about August and September 1939. And one can also say, yes, the Soviets helped the British and the Americans and the other allies win the war, but the Soviets helped the Germans to begin the Second World War. And one can imagine a Second World War which didn't begin with the German-Soviet alliance. But the Second World War in Europe, as we have it, began with the German-Soviet alliance. Hitler wanted a war, and that makes him different from Stalin. But Stalin gave Hitler that war, which makes him different from Poland or from other European powers who declined in various ways to take part, at least in that time. So I think when we think of the course of the war and all of its atrocities, we have to remember not only the Soviets liberating Auschwitz, but we have to remember that Auschwitz was once a Polish town called Oświęcim, which went into the German sphere of influence because of a treaty on borders and friendship between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Now, another way I would like to answer the question is this. We do not fully acknowledge the horrors that were visited upon the Soviet Union during the Second World War. We understand that the death tolls among prisoners among Soviet citizens were high in an abstract way, but we don't see some of the particular horrors. So, for example, as many Soviet prisoners of war died on a single day in October 1941 as American and British prisoners of war in German custody died over the course of the entire war. In a single day, in one day. The horror of what it means to starve surrounded by barbed wire, I think, has largely escaped us. And the Germans did that to the Soviets on purpose. I think we've also failed to understand the very intimate relationship between the invasion and the Holocaust, and the way in which the Holocaust was not only known and visible, but which it was a common project. We emphasize the Einsatzgruppen, but the Einsatzgruppen did not carry out all the shootings by themselves. They were helped by the German Order Police. They were helped by, and they were helped by the Wehrmacht from the very beginning. The Holocaust was almost from the very beginning the integral part of that war, and we, I think, have failed to fully grasp that. So on the one hand, in the sequence of events, I think we have to put the German-Soviet alliance in, just because that gave us the Second World War, which we all agree is so central, and also because it led immediately to the decapitation of Polish society. But also, and going in the other direction, I think we have to fully appreciate the range and the scale of the horror that was visited on the territory of the Soviet Union, which I don't think we've done. Some people have one posthumous book. Tony has two posthumous books.
That's a good answer.
One of them is called The Memory Chalet, which is published next month, and that collects those essays that Tony wrote in the last months of his life, starting with Night, almost to the end of his life last summer. And then there is a second book, which is called Thinking the 20th Century, which will be published in August of next year, which is a book of conversation between Tony and me about themes of 20th century intellectual history. I think the Holocaust, as we understand it, has a lot to do with how we think about ourselves, and the victims of the Holocaust who we pay the most attention to tend to be the people who remind us, by us I now mean people in Western Europe, the United States, of ourselves. But that's a long conversation. I think, though, that, more optimistically, I think the fact that we have this concept, the Holocaust, which we didn't always have, permits these kind of modifications. And I think the modifications, for all kinds of reasons, moral, historical, but also political, will make the Holocaust more robust and more memorable in the end. I think insofar as the pedagogical Holocaust falls short of the historical Holocaust, it's then open to challenges by people of bad faith in a way which the historical Holocaust, if we properly understand it, is not. Well, I'm going to try to answer that briefly, although demography comes into it in a lot of different ways. I think the crucial way that it comes into it is in terms of the perceived futures of Germany. When the Germans are making calculations about food, those calculations involve demography. The carrying capacity, which for us is a global concept, was for them a local concept. And their calculations about things like the Hunger Plan or Generalplan Ost had to do with how many people could be supported by how much land. And then once you make those calculations, you then are, of course, deciding after that who deserves to live and who deserves to die. And that is one of the ways in which economics, as a science of perceived futures, feeds into ideology, which is, among other things, a description of relative value of people in the present. And then demography comes into this in a different way, which is after technological change, none of this is nearly as plausible. All of this takes place in a certain technological moment, and we forget about that. Our ability to master the problems of demography comes after the Second World War, after all of this has happened. We now are going to have different problems of demography, which is why I worry about the 21st century. But the particular problems of demography that Stalin and Hitler took to be, as it were, iron laws of history, got resolved later on by purely technical rather than political means, which I take to be part of the tragedy of all of this. That's as far into this as I think I can go. Thanks. Well, the answer to the first question is that happily there are translations underway into, I think, 13 languages, including Hebrew and Russian and Polish. I think we're close to closing on Ukrainian. I'm not entirely without hope for Belarusian, although after the last essay that I wrote for the New York Review, I have less hope than I did before. And German, of course. So most of this will happen next year. So there will be a more or less contemporaneous discussion. With Russia, I think the problem with Stalin is there, but I think the deeper problem is a different comparison, which is the suffering of Russians as opposed to the suffering of Soviets. Because when one actually looks at the zone where people died, that zone includes the Western Soviet Union and some of Western Russia, which is, of course, not the same thing at all. But one sees very clearly, without being political about it, that what is now Belarus and what is now Ukraine suffered tremendously more than what is now independent Russia. The German armies simply don't reach very far into what is now Russia. Of course, there are horrible episodes which we forget or don't fully understand, like the siege of Leningrad, which I discussed at length. But nevertheless, compared to Ukraine and Belarus, in all of these tragedies, including the Holocaust, the suffering is much worse under the Germans. So how many Jews die in Russia in the Holocaust? About 60,000. So a very, very small number. In Belarus and Ukraine, we're talking about several hundred thousand and close and more than 1 million. So the scale is totally different. And then if you add to that the disproportionate suffering of people in the Soviet borderlands in famine and terror, you also have a sort of overlay of greater suffering in the non-Russian parts than in Russia. And I think that's the fundamental problem with the sort of Medvedev-era political narrative, which is that we get to inherit the suffering and the triumph of the Soviet Union. In fact, the suffering and the triumph of Russia, although I think very hard for people in America to understand, is significantly less than the suffering of Ukraine and Belarus and Poland, for that matter. And I think that's going to be the real problem of reception. But I lay out the numbers really clearly, and I discuss the Russian literature in the conclusion in the hope that there can be a discussion about it. The Germans go abroad. They do not bring their domestic policies with them. Their domestic policies are much tamer than their policies abroad. When the Soviets go abroad, they bring their domestic policies with them. Their domestic policies seem extraordinary to the people who are touched by them. But as you quite rightly say, what is simply happening is that the Soviets are extending their normal way of doing business to new territories. So, for example, if you look at Katyn, which in my mind is the supreme example of decapitation, on the Soviet side, you see the same mechanisms that functioned during the Great Terror. A very quick review of documents, the operational troikas, the very, very high rates of execution, and so on. And this is, of course, not just a bureaucratic continuity, it's a continuity of deeper practice. Although, in some cases, as you know better than me, it's sadder still than that, because there's a phase of cultivation which precedes the phase of decapitation. So elites are cultivated, they're drawn out in some way, they're brought to university, and then they're killed. That's a story of the Soviet Union as well. But yes, that's quite right. What happens to Poland is that Polish elites are identified as a class enemy, and they're removed as such, and it's perfectly consistent with what the Soviets do on their own territory. That is, in a sense, the essence of the whole thing. I want to pause on something very important which you said about Katyn, which is the part of the deep sadness of Katyn. Sorry, the deep sadness of Katyn, which is that these were not only military men who were attacked from the rear while they were fighting against the Wehrmacht, and then imprisoned and taken away. These were not only men with women and with wives and with children and with families and so on. These people represented the fruit of the attempt to create a Polish educated class. And they were not only engineers, but these were, and doctors, but veterinarians and botanists and agronomists, and essentially everyone who had a university degree. Because if you had a university degree, you were in the reserves. Whether you were Polish, incidentally, whether you were Polish or Jewish or Ukrainian or Belarusian by ethnicity, you were in the Polish reserves, which is why Belarusians and Ukrainians and Jews also died in Katyn, along with people who were ethnically Polish. But yes, in the introduction, in addition to the Ukrainian breadbasket, which is something that I stressed, I talk about the Polish political question as something which, in a broad way, unites Soviet and German leaderships. There is a deep historical past, as you say. There is also the common view that the Polish state, in its post-war borders, is illegitimate. The Soviet Union and Nazi Germany are both revisionist powers vis-a-vis Poland. And in addition to that, they both regard Poland as being a problem for their own paths of development. And so there are many overlapping ways in which they would like to destroy Poland as a political nation. And that language, by the way, the language I'm using, is the language they use. Destroying Poland as a nation, destroying Poland as a political nation. That's common to both sides. I think I should probably